The story goes as follows. Is it an earthquake, and its impact will start with the US as a people, as a country, as agenda, as their heritage, their culture? Are we going to witness a new United States of America, divided country, divided people, with a culture of hate, resentment, racism, Islamophobia, against everybody who's not with me, black and white agenda, no gray area? Is this where we are going with the United States of America? To where this will lead us with Europe? My understanding, Germany was the first country who convened the NATO with Obama, telling him we have to stand for our ethics, our values, our principles. Racism is not accepted, division is not accepted. We cannot accept this to go on. Is this going to build up on it? But for the region and for us, my understanding, we witnessed 4 major events recently. A meeting in Beirut for all the factions discussing the revisal and the reunity of the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which has been our embodiment for our national aspiration. Our guests worked very hard on this issue from day one, since the first Intifada. Where we go with this PLO back to the agenda? Is it true? Is it tactics? Is it genuine? Can it be translated to something real? Beirut meeting. And the second one, as far as I understand, Rome, Vatican recognizing the state of Palestine and opening an embassy, a flag, celebrating our presence in the heart of Europe, which is the Vatican. And this related in a way or another, whether I like it or not, to Muslim-Christian relationship. The other day we had the head of the churches in Jerusalem telling us very clearly, we don't share our churches. How come you are forced to church Al-Aqsa Mosque? This is an Islamic site since 1,400 years. No change of the status quo, respect, accept the status quo. No sharing of the churches, no sharing of the Muslim site. It has been there for 1,400 years. Can we translate this local church message through Rome to the Christian world? Yet to be seen after what happened in UNESCO. The third meeting, Paris, 70 countries, 2-state solution, freezing settlement, go back to negotiations. And yet, some Israeli voices said, how could you have such a meeting without the pride and the broom? My answer was, we are not married to the Israelis. We will never be with them in the same bedroom. We have been raped by the Israelis for the last 50 years. This has to be stopped. Is Paris conference a sign to bring back the ethics and the values, or to awaken the Israelis from where they are heading with this apartheid system in the making? I don't know. Yet to be seen. How can you translate whether we like the wording and the text of the Paris message? Can you translate it to reality on the ground? Especially with what is coming from Washington. And especially with Washington telling the Brits, go and veto anything at the United Nations Security Council till I go in as well to veto it. The fourth meeting, or the fourth conference, was Moscow. What is there in Moscow? Is it a Russian agenda, or have been used Palestinians as a ticket in the hands of the Russians for what they have been doing with the Israelis since day one? If those who don't remember Putin coming to Israel and backing Netanyahu in the early days, they should remember exactly bringing 2 million Russians to Israel and embracing Lieberman and starting business relationship. And now with the agenda with the Golan Heights and the security coordination with Israel on this, hit this or hit that. A big question. But what is for us in Moscow? All the faction there in Moscow, all the faction to say we need a unity government. Each one of those who went to Moscow has his own agenda. Hamas want to get back to the stage. Bring me back to the house. I'm a member of the society. Give me my share. I cannot afford to continue to be in the dark. I'm not Islamophobia. I'm not the terrorist. I'm part of the Palestinian society. I was elected. Give me back my share. Would Fatah give them back their share? Is President Abbas interested in translating this meeting to something tangible? And if so, what is the street is telling us? Sharing the cake? You want to be ministers and salaries and ranks? What is your agenda? I think today's meeting is to try to open this file or the different files or the contradiction between all these files. Can we understand, maybe to come with creative ideas with the speakers, what is the Palestinian agenda vis-a-vis the above? Washington in particular, which is going to change, I think, many faces and many relationships and many venues. And by the end of the day, what I used to call them our cousins, and accordingly to what they have been writing in the newspaper, we are the chosen people. And if so, no human law can apply on us. And if so, we can do whatever we want. Annex, occupy, control, whatever. We are the power. And now we have Trump will be in our house all the time. We don't need you. How can we move from this? I'm expecting the two speakers, Jerome Siegel, who came with the idea a long time ago with the Intifada, a Palestinian state, declare a Palestinian state. And he went to Tunis, he met Arafat, and later on he came here. We published for him at Aspasia his book on Palestinian state. Does he have something new to tell us? Are we expecting him to come all the way from the States to tell the Palestinians, what is your agenda? Where are you going? Or he's going to provoke us with this ugly reality. It's racism, it's culture of hate, it's division. Yet Sam Bahour might tell us, no guys, put aside all these players, whomever you call them, Fatah, Hamas, president, faction, and let's think about the people of Palestine. These people who stood fast for 50 years under occupation, we are not broken, we are not melted, and we are not disappearing. We are still steadfastness with the message I received on daily basis from the youth. Resist to exist for dignity towards freedom and independence as part of the Palestinian society. Resist to exist. Is it part of our agenda? Can we pass the message to the Israelis to awaken them to the reality that they are, or to help Israel from its own situation? Because by the end of the day, we are here too. Like some Israelis are telling me, 5 million Palestinians, 5 million Israelis today. Forget the narrative. We agree what happened. We disagree maybe on the reading of the narrative. But reality today, we are stuck together on the same territory with different agenda, with different feelings, with different attitudes. Yet by the end of the day, you, the international community, the representatives of the world, where are you on this? Not a question of ethics and values. My understanding, the West created Israel, moved the Jewish question from Europe to the Middle East to Palestine. Fine, 100 years since Balfour Declaration. Now you come to see this baby you created in my land is killing himself and killing me too. Are you going to watch it? Where are you? Can you be visible with your flags and your cars and your presence in this house all the time to tell me that I'm not in the jungle forever, to open the window of my prison and to tell my cousins, you cannot have it in both ways. You cannot have it both ways. So let's listen to Jerome Siegel, and then we move to Sam Bahour. And I expect you to be provocative as much as you can. Take notes. Pick up their remarks. Don't let it go smoothly with no confrontation. Fine? Agreed? Democracy in the making. تفضل.
So, I'm going to, talk about what I see as sort of strategic opportunities, and I want to, at least at the outset, mention three different strategic approaches. Though I'm going to speak primarily about the first of these, but I want to sort of put all three on the table. The first of them still accepts that the two-state solution is a real possibility, and it still believes that ultimately it can be brought about through negotiations. And maybe it takes the perspective that that's the only way, in fact, that the conflict can be resolved is through negotiations. So that's the one orientation. The second orientation basically says, look, we've had negotiations now since 1993, so that's 17 plus 16, 17, what is that? Over 30 years? No, I'm sorry. It's 22 years, 23 years. Okay. That's longer than the space of time between the end of World War I and the end of World War II. I mean, that's just, think of all that happens in world history in such a period of time. And this is what's happened since the PLO, the Palestinian people, basically ceded the most fundamental issue in the conflict, which is recognizing Israel's right to exist, which was done first in '88 and then second on the White House lawn, repeated in 1993. And you would have thought that it wouldn't have taken 5 years that Oslo talked about to end the conflict, but maybe 9 months at that point. But they got into a slow process, step by step, that was a 5-year process. And now we've gone on for 24 years. It's an absurdity, and it has worked out to be basically Shamir's idea, which is I'm going to drag out the negotiations for a decade and put 1 million settlers in the territories, and there'll be the facts on the ground which will resolve the whole thing. So that perspective basically says negotiations are a farce. They've proved that they can't go anywhere. They won't go anywhere. There's nobody on the Israeli side. And instead, it goes to unilaterally creating the Palestinian state. And then the third perspective is one that says, no, it's the two-state solution actually is over. We're past that. The only thing actually is there is a one-state solution, and it's not for the future, it's already here. We have one state that for a half a century has controlled all of the territory from the river to the sea. It's been maintaining a fiction that it's not one country by these negotiations. But actually it is one country under the rule of one government, only it's vastly unequal. And what's needed is to face up to the fact that it is one country and then to launch a process for equality, democracy inside of that one country. So those are the three broad orientations that I see, and maybe there are more, but those are the three. And I want to just say a little bit more about the second one, since I'm actually identified primarily with it, but I'm not going to talk about it today. What I want to do is just to set in a little bit of context. And it also will help in thinking about the history here, but it's also an indirect way I want to get to express some appreciation for Passia and Mahdi. And I just want to read you a page or so from an article that was published in Al-Quds in April of 1988. So the Intifada was 4 months old at the time, and I went into Al-Quds and I sat down with someone who was in an editorial capacity, and I asked them if I told them who I was, and I asked them if they'd be interested in my publishing something in the paper, and they said very much so. It turned out that person was Saeb Erekat, who was working there, and that's when I met him. I didn't know what the future would hold. So, but this is a little bit from that piece at the time, and it's about strategy. And I wrote, "It's time to rethink some of the basic premises. Up to now, Palestinians have placed tremendous import on an international conference, negotiations, and PLO representation at such negotiations. Not much is heard about what happens if such negotiations begin and then deadlock. Perhaps it is believed that the price of failure would be so great that once started it would necessitate a comprehensive solution. Yet this is wishful thinking. It's perfectly likely that the negotiations will simply be unable to generate a solution acceptable to both Israelis and Palestinians. And it is also unlikely that the superpowers will lack the will, or it's also likely that the superpowers will lack the will to impose a solution. If we probe a bit deeper, we see that the present strategy for attaining an independent Palestinian state embodies a model which needs to be challenged. That model is that statehood emerges from negotiations and agreement. In short, it assumes that no Palestinian state can come into existence unless there is prior Israeli approval. Yet consider how Israel itself came into existence. Following the United Nations Partition Resolution of 1947, the Israelis simply declared the existence of the State of Israel. Indeed, they made that declaration contrary to the urging of the U.S. State Department. They did not get Arab or Palestinian advance approval. They did not negotiate with the Palestinians. They proceeded unilaterally and gradually secured international recognition, admission to the United Nations, and effective control of territory. There are important analogies and disanalogies here for the Palestinians. Today's military and political realities totally preclude achieving statehood through force of arms. But on the other hand, today's political, moral, economic, and social and psychological realities offer new alternatives within the same basic concept. The Palestinians do not need advance Israeli approval to bring a state into existence, and there's no reason why they should cede such power to Israel. Indeed, to do so is inconsistent with the underlying spirit of the uprising. The term intifada hadn't yet even come into existence at that time. The alternative strategy is possible, an alternative strategy is possible, one which overnight will transform the political agenda and place a two-state solution at center stage as the only peace option. Here's how it might proceed. And I gave 10 points, and I'll just mention 2. 1, the PLO issues a Declaration of Independence and Statehood announcing the existence of the State of Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza. Simultaneously, the Declaration of Independence and Statehood is announced throughout the territories. And 2, the PLO proclaims as its final act its transformation into the provisional government of the State of Palestine. The Palestinian National Council, the PNC, is transformed into the legislative body of the provisional government. All governmental positions are declared provisional, pending the possibility of free elections by the Palestinian people. And then I went on to, a dozen more pieces. And this was, as I say, in April. In and around, at the end of July, King Hussein issued his famous withdrawal of Jordanian responsibility and claims of authority and so on. And at exactly that moment, the Shin Bet raided the offices of Faisal Husseini and found some documents there that were a plan to issue a Declaration of Independence, which became known as the Husseini document. And it wasn't known, and the document at first wasn't released, just the existence of it. But information came out about it. And a reporter, my piece had been published in Al-Quds, and then it had been reprinted actually in the Washington Post and in the International Herald Tribune. So it was widely known, especially in Washington circles. And there was a reporter from an Israeli paper, Mariv, in Washington, and she saw the relationship between some of the ideas, not all of them, and it remained some important differences between the Husseini document and what I wrote. But she saw enough of the similarities and didn't see the differences, I think. And Mariv wrote a headline that said, Jewish professor, author of Husseini document, because nobody here had been identified as that because it was secret, and the person who wrote the Husseini document would be arrested and so forth. Well, in any event, it became a very big thing. And the Israeli press got excited about it, loved the idea that, a good Jewish boy who grew up in the Bronx was, in their words, the Herzl for the Palestinians and so on. And the New York Times, wrote stuff about Jewish father, a Palestinian state, a lot of, talk, right? But understandably, it created a certain amount of resentment here because the Intifada, of course, was the real thing that was the process of state creation. And it was in that context, and then I turned my article into a book, which I published in English, called Creating the Palestinian State, A Strategy for Peace. And then I attended the 19th PNC, in which the declaration, which was written by Mahmoud Darwish, and was different in many ways from both the Husseini document and the specifics of my proposal, but in some ways similar. But anyway, then I came back here. And Mahdi hosted me to give a roundtable talk about either the declaration, past, present, and future, and so on, which I did at Passia. And then subsequently, as he mentioned, he helped me get a translation of my book into Arabic, and then Passia published it. And he did that in a way that was, straightforward. And it was in the context, as I say, of a certain amount of resentment, and people say, well, don't emphasize this Jewish guy, and so on. And I just never had an opportunity to publicly thank him previously for his role in this, and I just wanted to say that. So thank you, Mahdi. Now, let me say a word about Trump. First of all, people, want to know what's Trump's policy going to be. Anybody who tells you what it's going to be doesn't know what he's talking about, because there is no Trump policy. You have to imagine sort of a head that there's nothing inside of it that has anything to do with policy. There's stuff inside of it. It's not just he doesn't have policy on the Middle East. There are no policy commitments. There's no ideology in there. On this issue, at the beginning of the campaign, we had all of these Republican midgets on that stage there, right? And they all went trotting off to Las Vegas to meet with Sheldon Adelson and to kiss his ring as if he was the Pope and so on, but basically to get campaign contributions and so on. Trump was the only person who didn't go out there, and at that stage said some things about, I'd like to be the honest broker, and you have to, and we'll see, and so on. But it was remarkably encouraging that this guy didn't join this procession. But then, of course, as it became more possible that he was actually going to win the nomination, he flip-flopped, and he gave a speech at AIPAC that the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. participated in the writing of that speech, Ron Dermer, with Trump's son-in-law. And then he talks, as we know now, about maybe about moving the embassy and so on. But at the same time, he still keeps talking about this is the ultimate deal. And the reality about Trump, the only thing that's real about him, is that he is a deal maker. I read a little bit of his book called The Art of the Deal. And it is remarkable his way of life. He gave the first chapter was about how he spends each day of a week. And he talks about making 150 phone calls every day. And every one of those phone calls is about a different deal. There's 150 balls up in the air, and it's global. It's New York City, it's Atlantic City, it's Indonesia, it's Australia, and so on, in one day, right? And he wrote this book 30 years ago. He was never thinking about being president. This is who he is. So the only thing I could say about Trump, though, that is important from a strategic point of view, is that Palestinians should try to move him into the identity that he aspires to, which is to be the deal maker. And he knows, actually, and has said at certain points, that to do that effectively, you actually do have to be the honest broker. Now, it may not be as honest as one would appreciate, but it's important. It's really quite important that he be moved into that space where he comes to believe that a deal is really possible. Now, you've got one thing going against him, which is, of course, the failure, among other things, of John Kerry. And if anybody else had been elected president, nobody else would touch the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a 10-foot pole. And they would see the failure of Kerry on top of the failure of the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, Jimmy Carter, and so on, as the textbook lesson of the mistake that presidents make of investing their presidential capital, time, and energy in the quicksand of this conflict, which in international terms, in their view, has gotten of less and less importance anyhow. So no one would touch this with a 10-foot pole. The only thing that counteracts that is that Trump looks at all these people and he says, what do they know about making a deal? You know, I am the only person who really knows how to make a deal. So it is possible, despite all experience, and he won't listen to anybody else. So Tillerson will tell him, this is a mistake, you know, let's focus on something else or attend something else. But if he thinks a deal is possible, I think it's like a giant magnet, because he doesn't really care about policy, actually. If you asked him, I think, what would you view as a success of your presidency? Actually, if he ended up making this deal, that would be the main thing, and he could go home happy, and so on. So that's sort of there. Now, there's another thing about Trump, that's the meaning of Trump, and it's very interesting. It's that Trump is a catalyst to something amazing, and we're going to see the fact that Trump, the American president, is the most powerful person in the world, right? The fact that the United States picked, of 350 million people, this empty man, this crude man, this man who has no respect for institutions and so on, and anointed him the most powerful person in the world, is actually a world historical event, almost as if the gods in a Greek tragedy or comedy were making fun of humanity and were bored with what happens on the planet, and says, you know, almost like in the book of Job, but there at least there was an issue, but just for their own amusement said, let's make the most absurd human being the most powerful human being on the world, and let's see what happens. Well, one of the things that is happening actually is that an appreciation of this event is dawning on the world, and we're going to see the day after Trump is inaugurated, in the United States, a million women are coming to Washington to protest one day into his presidency. And we're going to see demonstrations in 500 cities in the United States and events around the world before it even gets started. And what's happening is that there's a release of creativity that is occurring and energy to do something about this. And I think that that has to do with a decision to make this happen out of Trump. And I think the Palestinians can do the same thing. If you go back and think about what was happening here during the Intifada, with the energy and creativity that we saw in the first Intifada, I think the arrival of Trump, if you define it as this, can be used for an outpouring of Palestinian creativity when you combine that with the half-century anniversary of the occupation that's coming up next June. I think those two things together are an opportunity for a tremendous release here of new energy, new thinking, and new behavior. So now I want to go on and talk about the primary thing that that I have in mind, which really has to do with sticking with the negotiations strategy. And I would say a couple of things about this. First of all, in the quarter of a century almost of negotiations that we've actually only had a very limited experience with real negotiations over final status. We didn't get them until, we had sort of the Camp David-Taba period for, let's say, 9 months, if we go back a little bit before that, under Barack. And then we had serious negotiations between Olmert and Abu Mazen. And that's really it. I mean, we had something, but it wasn't serious negotiations under Netanyahu. So the actual period in which there was a deliberate attempt in that quarter of a century to resolve in negotiations the final status issues, I'd say just time-wise, probably less than 2 years under two distinct presidencies and two different chairmen of the PLO. So it's much less negotiating experience than one often thinks, unless you see it that way. Secondly, I would say that remember that this is a conflict between the two peoples. Okay? It's not a conflict between the PLO and the government of Israel. It's a conflict between the two peoples, between two nationalisms, and ultimately the audience for the Palestinians and Palestinian policies has to be the Israeli people. And it'll be the Israeli people because they're a democracy, among other things, that will choose the government and will choose the people in the Knesset who will have to ratify a treaty in any event. And you won't be able to reach an agreement until you get a different government in Israel in any event. So the target has not got to be Netanyahu and so on. It's got to be always thinking about the Israeli people. And I would say this gives almost sort of a simple way of thinking about what the outline of a strategy would be, just in terms of two principles, to my mind. One is, as people are very familiar with, there can be no cost-free occupation. But we can talk very importantly about what we mean by cost, okay? But obviously, if there's no cost to the occupation, it just becomes very comfortable, and there are many reasons why it will simply go on forever. Okay. At the same time, I would say the most fundamental thing that needs to be articulated and again is that peace has to be credible. That is, the Israeli public have to believe that real peace is really possible. And here you have to make a very strong distinction between a peace agreement and real peace. They're very different things. And I researched this. We did a big study, which came out in a book called Negotiating Jerusalem, but it was broader than that, of Israeli, and then we did with Palestinian partner, of Palestinian attitudes. And we asked Israelis, this is in 1995, at the height of Rabin's popularity, 2 years into Oslo. And we asked Israelis whether or not they thought that successful negotiations would result in lasting peace. And that 2/3 of Israeli Jews said no, that they didn't think that negotiation success would give you lasting peace. Okay? Well, if you don't believe that negotiations success will give you lasting peace, then you're not losing the possibility of lasting peace if you have in place a government like Netanyahu who's not really serious about the negotiations. You're not losing real peace, you're just losing the piece of paper, which explains one of the big paradoxes, which is why consistently do Israelis poll left? That is, when you ask the Israeli public their views about the two-state solution, about the Geneva Accord, and so on, they always end up giving you a left-wing majority. And then they go to the polls and they vote a right-wing government. How do you explain that? And to me, the basic explanation is that they don't believe that a right-wing government actually is causing them to lose the opportunity of peace because they don't think a peace agreement will give them that. And you have, among other things, everybody's forgotten about it, but you may remember, Israel once had a peace treaty with Lebanon, right? There was a signing ceremony, right? A real treaty between Israel and Lebanon. And no one even remembers it. It was so irrelevant to changing the relationships between Israel and Lebanon. So I would say there's always this. Now, it's very simple. So you've got these two things, right? No cost-free occupation. And on the other hand, with respect to every tactic and every strategy, you have to put it to a litmus test. Does this make peace more credible or less credible? Well, it turns out that in reality, it's proved for Palestinians extremely difficult, actually, to do both of those things at the same time. That the choice of tactics for making it no longer a cost-free occupation can be tactics that fail the simple litmus test. Are you making peace more credible or less credible? And so one of the things that's being talked about now, and I won't mention his name, but I had a conversation yesterday. I just about fell off my chair with one of the most prominent Palestinian peacemakers and one of the most creative ones, and was talking to him about, what might Palestinians do going forward. And he said, well, it's time really to end security cooperation. And I couldn't believe it. He said, well, we won't promote terrorism, but we won't stand in the way of it either. Okay. Well, yes, that would in fact end the cost-free occupation. like the Second Intifada did. The Second Intifada, among its many impacts, destroyed the Israeli left. Right? It allowed Israelis to talk about the Oslo criminals. Right? So the idea is that if you focus in a one-sided way on one of these principles and forget about the other, things will just be completely undone here. Because the Israelis, if they don't believe that peace is really possible, and you do raise the cost of the occupation, they're not going to withdraw and allow a Palestinian state to emerge here that is not committed to peace. And what Hamas has demonstrated, actually, is that while a Palestinian state in the West Bank won't be an existential threat, nonetheless, it can make life impossible for Israelis if you've got, let's say, mortars exploding a few miles away on Ben Gurion Airport. One mortar, or rocket, as it were, that landed a mile from Ben Gurion Airport caused the United States to issue a warning that American planes should not fly to Tel Aviv. One rocket. Okay, so just imagine if there was a hostile state that was based here. So you would make life impossible. But the Israeli response to that ultimately is going to be what we saw with the Second Intifada: counter-violence, legitimized because they've already gone through the some sort of process, statehood, unilateral withdrawal, whatever people think. But basically, the violence would be beyond what we saw. And in any event, historically, Jews, the one thing that we have is an unbelievable capacity to absorb pain. So cost-free, one has to think about how do you inflict costs or maintain costs that are consistent with peace being credible. In fact, how do you sometimes make peace more credible? And I'm running short on time, so I just want to mention, and I'll just mention them, what I would call game changers, okay? API. Okay, API is a wonderful idea, right? Normalization of the Arab world. The problem is the API came too late. Right? What do I mean by too late? It came after Sadat, after the treaty with Jordan, after the treaty with Egypt. Imagine the API if it came before that and said, you want peace with the Arab world, you want peace with Egypt, make peace with the Palestinians. After that, Israel already had a very robust treaty with Egypt, had a peace treaty with Jordan, and today Syria is no more, Saddam Hussein's Iraq is no more. Exactly what does the APA, in terms of Israeli security, put on the table? The game changer is getting Iran to endorse in a clear-cut, robust way the API. Now, if Israel's relationship with Iran are dependent on them making peace with the Palestinians, then you have a whole new thing. Then real Israeli national security interests are involved, and national security interests of the United States are involved, because the Israeli game plan, which Obama thwarted, is to pull the United States into a war with Iran. And that game plan is still in place, and that's real. That clock is ticking. So now, even if you can't get Iran to do that, just having the Palestinians be the prominent leader of the movement to get Iran to stand behind the Palestinians by joining the APA, the API puts the Palestinians in an incredible place. It means that the Palestinians are, in fact, engaged in trying to do something that affects national security interests of both Israel and the United States big time. They're suddenly a world player by playing this role. And you can develop a very powerful strategy for, in fact, affecting Iran. I won't go into it, but that's an area for creative thinking. How, in fact, can you force Iran to do this, or shame them, or cause them to suffer a price if they don't join it? So that's one game changer that's worth thinking about. A second thing is a new kind of peace process. Now, we know what the existing thing has looked like in the past, and we know there's been all this talk about parameters. Okay, I think it's time to leapfrog parameters and do something different. And I've talked about something called UNSCOP 2. UNSCOP was the only time the international community actually developed a detailed plan and a map for resolving the conflict. It happened once in the history of the conflict. And it was the most important thing that the United Nations ever did vis-a-vis this was the partition resolution. We could have UNSCOP too, but there are all sorts of problems with that and so on, and I've written about it and so on. You could have also something that takes an existing thing like Geneva and call it a 9-month Geneva process. I'm not saying impose it. UNSCOP 1 was an imposed solution. But I'm saying use a detailed treaty as a jumping off point for negotiations. In other words, have a detailed treaty that just needs to be signed, put on the table for 9 months, have the two parties come together to see if they can come up with mutually acceptable amendments to that. After 9 months, they have to say yes, no, or put it to a referendum of their people. And we'll have decision time, and then we'll know the negotiations is possible or not possible. Now, my current proposal for this is a little bit different, and it fits with this thing of pulling Trump into the mix, okay? I would have the Arab states, maybe Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, publicly call on Trump to, consistent with the Arab Peace Initiative, because the Arab states are not going to modify the API and turn it into something with full details and substance. That's off the table. But to call on Trump to, consistent with the Arab Peace Initiative, draft a detailed treaty that just needs to be signed, and then call on Israel and the PLO to spend 9 months negotiating with that as the basis. And then let's see what happens. So that would be a very big game changer. And maybe the Israeli government would say no. But if it says no and the PLO says yes, we've changed the whole narrative as to who's standing in the way, and we've moved the API into incredible prominence. And then, of course, if that's coupled with a PLO or Palestinian effort to bring the Iranians in as endorsers of the API, then it takes on global significance. So these two things really work together. Okay. Third idea is some new thinking about final status, right? Everybody says we know all the answers. Okay, that's crazy. That really is crazy. There's so much potential creativity and so many things that, were problematic about the answers. But I would offer one thing that I've written to some extent about and so on, and it's called the common homeland approach. And among other things, I'll just say one little bit about it, which is that it becomes an alternative to asking the Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. It starts out basically with a joint affirmation by both Israel and the PLO, and it's a joint affirmation that affects the status of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And what it says is, to a certain extent, it says, no, Israel is not, as it were, the homeland of the Jewish people. It says something different. It says all of the land between the river and the sea is the common homeland of both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. And so it says that the Palestinians who are living inside of Israel are living in their own homeland. They may be living in Israel, they may be living in something that's a Jewish state, but you can't tell them that you're not living in your homeland, and so go somewhere else, okay? At the same time, it speaks to the people who feel in Israel who quite accurately tell you that read the Bible and answer this question, right? Where were the major population centers of the Jewish people that are in the Torah? And they were in Hebron and in Jerusalem and in Nablus and so on. They're in the hill country. And so they say, the homeland is elsewhere. On the other hand, you say there have to be two states in the interest of peace. But then you move into a very different way of thinking about the relationships between the two states. And rather than strict separation, you have a pledge, actually, for to the maximum extent possible, to have there be respect for the fact that this is the common homeland of the two people. And Israel becomes something that's more open for the Palestinians and for the Palestinian refugees. And similarly, there's a way in which the territories are more open to Israeli citizens. But that becomes negotiations of policy between the two states. It doesn't even have to be resolved in negotiations. That becomes the living policy issue that's worked out over the next century of relationships between the two states. And we have experiments. Some things work, some things don't work, and so on, and ebb and flow like trade policy. Okay. Fourth. Final note. Okay, I'll say two other things. One word, RPI. we have the API, you get to the refugee section, and it's just garbage, right? It's just the empty words. Fair solution based on 194 means nothing or means totally different things depending on who's spinning the thing. What we've never had in the history of the conflict is the refugees themselves coming forward and saying what they would accept as resolution of the conflict. And ultimately, I don't believe the conflict can be resolved unless the refugees believe that they've achieved at least some form of what Arafat used to call relative justice. But the refugees have never said what that is. Total game changer in making peace credible if the refugees themselves come forward with what they're talking about. And finally, I would say something that people won't like to hear, I think, which is that to make peace credible, let's do peace education now. Let's bring together, in every stage of their education, Israeli children with Palestinian children from elementary school through college, and let them talk to each other about the experiences, about their narratives. You've got a narrative that is a lot in it that Israelis need to know and need to hear. And you should be going for an opportunity to teach that to the next generation of Israelis. And Israelis have got things that they've got to say to the next generation of Palestinians. Making that peace education possible now is something that will make lasting peace credible. That's my fifth game changer. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we'll have a rich argument later on. Can you keep the door open, please, because it's too hot? Can you keep the door open? We can differ a lot with your presentation, Jerome, and many footnotes here and there, maybe one of them about the Arab Initiative. I just would like to remind you that there is no Arab world as you expect in the 90s or the 80s. I should remind you of Sisi withdrawing the draft resolution from the United Nations Security Council. I should remind you with the Saudi foreign minister is already on the lap of Trump and telling him, come and support us with our preemptive war against Iran in Yemen. We don't have that partner. And on the top of that, the Israelis themselves don't accept in the first place the Arab Initiative. And they want to have it twisted a different direction, which is mean recognize me, normalize with me, and then we will consider the Palestinians. And now we have real setback. For us, it was shocking, not the news of the Syrian coming to Israel and talking about peace with Israel as an opposition of the Syrian, but our surprise was it took them too long to come. 5 years of war in Syria, now they are coming to tell the Israel. It's too much complicated to simplify it. And the other note, with your end note about bringing children together, their parents will not bring them in the first place. Come and see the Israeli army shooting our children in the streets. Come and see what is happening in Jabal al-Mukabbar, closing the neighborhood and harassing the women and just children. It's a different culture, different society, different world today. And on the top of that, we are facing with this man with empty brain, empty head. You are telling us to do a deal with him. What can we offer an empty head? Maybe Sam Bahur can reflect a different perspective on this. I'm frustrated because you are taking us to a direction which is not there as before. It's a new world, new society, new people with a military fist. I don't want to continue this because it's very painful. Sam, please.
Good evening. I need to bring this kind of higher up. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Mehdi and Passia, for inviting me. Yeah. No, it raises by itself when I start speaking. First, I must note, as a Palestinian American, an American citizen born in Ohio, it's very embarrassing to be an American today. So this is a platform which allows me to have a closed discussion with many friends. So this is helpful to my therapy. The other note that I would like to make up front, and it's similar to the one Jeremy made, is I was asked to come to give some reflections about Trump and the Palestinian strategy. And I focused a lot on reflections, because anyone who believes that they have enough information to do an analysis or has enough track record of this person to be able to actually predict, I think is lying. So what we can provide is reflections based not only on the person, but on the state that the person represents, which I think is the more interesting discussion. I'll get to that in a second. Ironically, the Trump win is very similar to the Hamas win in terms of him being a minority president, not receiving the popular vote majority, and coming forward because mainly of a protest vote. And I think the Electoral College, the electoral system, somebody's phone can't be stopped, the Electoral College and the protest vote together is what brought Trump to the forefront. Definitely it wasn't his party because he alienated himself from his party. And definitely it wasn't the constituencies which make up usually the voting blocks. Women, Hispanics, African Americans. He basically burned bridges with all of those constituencies. And that's one of the reasons why the polls got it wrong. Polling in America is a very, very sophisticated industry. However, the basis of that industry is based on demographics. So they calculate clusters of people and they kind of extrapolate from those clusters. There's an excellent article, I'll refer you to. It came out last week in the Huffington Post from a professor, he's a retired professor, George Lakoff. He wrote an article, it's a long one, an analysis, it's called The Minority President. And he goes through very systematically why and how Trump won. Because what he's reflecting, as Jeremy said perfectly, is not depth of policy or an articulation of policy, but rather he's representing a shift in the value system in the US, which is cross-cutting across the various clusters. This is an important dynamic to keep in place. The US is changing. Similar to how we've seen during the last decade, Israel changing. It's not about Netanyahu. It's about a community which has changed to be able to elect Netanyahu so many times. And that's something to keep in mind as well. To address the topic tonight of Trump and Palestinian strategy, I first want to just make a note so we can start kind of structurally. What is the Palestinian strategy, if there is one? I would claim there is a strategy. And I don't believe the talk that we are lost and we are in a jungle and we have nowhere to go and we're just waiting for things to come together with the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation so we can get our act together. I don't believe that. I don't buy into that. I think the Palestinian side over time has developed a very concrete strategy, and it revolves around the following. 1, 2 states. 2 states is a clear strategy of the Palestinian leadership, and not only this Fatah-run leadership in the West Bank, but the PLO leadership ever since 1988, and I would actually go back to 1974. It's not where the Palestinian movement started. The Palestinian movement, after a decade of shock after 1948, started with the thinking around one state. But even that is kind of needs some analysis, because we've been programmed to think that there's only 2 solutions to this conflict, a one-state solution or a 2-state solution. Who says? Who says? There's one state and there's flavors to that. There's 2 states and there's flavors to that. But there's parallel sovereignty, there's common homeland, there's federation, there's confederation, there's a parallel sovereignty, there's a condominium arrangement. I don't know why they call it political science. They should call it political art. The Palestinian side has rested on a 2-state solution, not out of a sole desire to choose, as if we're walking into a restaurant and choosing from a menu, but rather it came about because of the PLO's alignment with international law as being the framework, the ultimate parameters to a solution with the Israeli side. And that set of parameters, which are embedded and codified in international law, calls upon the Palestinian side to align with 2 states. That's the first part of our strategy, and it's not new. The second is, and this came after 20 years of failed negotiations, via a bilateral negotiation process called Oslo. What has ended is not the Palestinian desire to negotiate. If we had, and I'll get to that in a second, if we had a better communication team, negotiations for or against should not even be a question asked. Ultimately, we will negotiate. If I didn't think that was the fact, I'd be putting a hat around and gathering some funds to be able to buy our first F-16. You either negotiate or you impose by military force a reality. We don't have the ability to force a reality. So we will ultimately negotiate. But that's a vague term. How will we negotiate? After 20 years, thankfully, the Palestinian leadership finally said no more bilateral negotiations. And that takes us to the third pillar of the strategy, which is not internationalizing the conflict. The conflict was international at birth. It took it back to the international fora to be able to say, basically, we have failed. And that was the strategy of 2011, prior to that UNESCO, then 2011, when we went into the General Assembly, we went into the Security Council and requested membership in the UN. And as you all well know, the US looked at us and said, you better not. If you bring this to vote, we will veto it. 20, 25, 30 years ago, the Palestinian side would have probably said, so what? We're bringing it anyway to embarrass you, US. But we've become sophisticated in our politics. In 2011, when we were challenged by this veto, we basically said, okay, we won't bring it to vote. Let's put it in a Security Council committee. And that's where it sits today. We waited 1 year. During that year, settlement building was accelerated like never before. 2012, we bring the resolution to the General Assembly calling for statehood. And basically, I highly recommend, if you haven't already done so, even if you've done so, do it again. Read the resolution itself. The resolution is 100% aligned with US policy. It says, two states, based on the 1967 border, that's something I wouldn't have done if I was them. There's no reason to negotiate unilaterally. We could have said on the 1967 border, but that was a concession given up front yet again. We don't learn our lessons easily. And it also talks about the need to negotiate the shared border. That approach to the General Assembly resulted in what? 138 countries saying yes, 9 saying no. You know the 9, right? The US, Israel, the Czech Republic, Canada, Panama, the superpower of Micronesia, the superpower of Palau, and the superpower of the Marshall Islands, and the superpower of Nauru. That's where the US put itself. The significance of that move was not to flutter in front of the community of the international world and say, see, we were right. The world community is with us. I'm sure we did a little bit of that with that huge chair that was in Ramallah, if you saw it while you were here. What's more important is that with those 138 votes came a new toolbox to the Palestinian side. And when we opened up the toolbox, there were tools that we didn't understand. You can now become an International Criminal Court member. You can actually enter into, I don't know what it is, 522 different treaties, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, we had to learn how to act like a state. So we tried our luck, and we started to enter international treaties and venues. And as you know, during the 2011 UNESCO move, the US side immediately, when we became a full member, knee-jerk reaction, because the Clinton administration had already legislated this. The knee-jerk reaction was what? If any UN venue accepts the PLO or Palestine as a full member, the US will cut funds off of that organization. I guess at the time it was 35% of UNESCO's budget was coming from the US. So all of a sudden, the Palestinian leadership is getting calls from countries in sub-Saharan Africa and other places saying, what are you doing? Somebody in Kenya didn't get a book this week because you decided you wanted to become a member in the UN. So I think the Palestinian side slowed down and said, hey, this is a very powerful tool, but we need to watch how we use it, because we can alienate ourselves from our own allies if we don't use it wisely. And I think the leadership actually then started to very slowly act, and actually is using it as a reaction to some of the movement that's happening from the US side. So when things don't happen in the international community, which is I think what will happen if he moves the embassy, if Trump moves the embassy, they're not going to attack because we have no capacity to attack. They will enter more and more UN venues, putting the US into a bind because legislation-wise, they will have to stop funding those agencies. When you stop funding agencies, you start to have less leverage in those agencies. So that's going to be a very messy period of time. Back to the UN Fora was the third pillar of what I would claim is our strategy. The fourth part of our strategy is nonviolence. And I believe it has been articulated systematically from the highest levels of the Palestinian leadership. When I say nonviolence, I say nonviolence from the officialdom. Nobody has control on individual acts of violence, and very few people, especially the PA leadership today, with its very limited legitimacy from a popular perspective, is able to control civil society's acts, which may turn out to be violent. But the officialdom, what the PA has under its realm of control, has been systematically nonviolent. And as Jeremy mentioned, it's not only nonviolent, it's in security cooperation to make sure they do all they can to make sure the other components of the society remain so. So we do have a strategy. That strategy, codified in international law, I would call the parameters. Since parameters is a very sexy term, and Clinton did it, and now Kerry did it, I think we need to rephrase what parameters means in this conflict, and it's back to UN parameters, which are codified and accepted by the entire international community, and that's part of the value of UN Resolution 2334. Unanimously, there was a confirmation that the parameters of the UN apply to us, mainly that this is a military occupation, and I think that should not be taken lightly. The crisis, in my opinion, on the Palestinian strategy side, remember, I'm trying to scope out our strategy, is in implementation. There's a weakness, there's an inherent weakness in our ability to communicate it and to act proactively politically. It seems, I'm not in the PA, I never was, but from an observer perspective, it seems the mode of operation of the Palestinian leadership, the current Palestinian leadership, is to be overly cautious and wait for others to make mistakes. That works because others make mistakes. But when others make mistakes, they usually repair those mistakes on our behalf and continue to go forward. So waiting for some kind of critical mistake to be done, like Trump moving the embassy, thinking that's going to spill over into some kind of resolution or progress from our strategy perspective, I think is a misnomer. We have to become proactive within the terms of our parameters. So that's the strategy. In addition to the strategy, as Dr. Mehdi mentioned, I think we cannot discuss this with Trump-Palestine without taking in the ecosystem that we're currently living in. And very quickly, I'll just run down them because I believe we're all aware of them. We don't understand them maybe, but aware of them. The regional collapse. The regional collapse cannot be underestimated. States work on interests, not on deal making, not I love Putin and we're going to kiss and go play golf. They work on interests. Palestine strategically does not have the kinds of interests that make other countries deal with us in a more serious way. Israel does. So the issue of us losing our Arab depth is strategic in a negative sense to us. And currently, even though we have probably thousands of problems with Jordan and with Egypt, we have no option but to remain in some kind of alliance with those two countries because the rest of the Arab world doesn't exist for the most part. And Saudi Arabia as well would be a third one. The other ecosystem issue is our disunity. I think disunity is overrated. Yes, I want unity, but yes, that's an internal Palestinian issue. We have to solve it. And the international community should, I think, slow down on the issue of we can't do anything now unless there's unity. I come from the US. Disunity there was called civil war, and blood fell before it became unified. Hopefully we won't go that far, but it is a domestic issue that we have to solve. In the meantime, the international community has its address for Palestine. It's sitting at the UN with the majority of the countries of the world recognizing it. There's no lack of address if you, as a third state, want to get involved with Palestine. So that's the disunity issue is an important one, but it shouldn't be the showstopper for progress. Lack of popular legitimacy for the Palestinian Authority, a key issue. There is no vacuum, in my opinion, in politics. No vacuum whatsoever. Where there's a vacuum, somebody will fill it. So yes, Abbas has entered his 12th or the 13th or 14th year of a 4-year term. He is still officially, legitimately, from a political level, the leader in charge. Does he have popular legitimacy amongst our people? It's probably this big right now. But again, it's the political legitimacy which should be interest of third states. I can mention many states around the world who don't have popular legitimacy for their leaders. Trump would be a good one to mention, right? The minority president. The other point I would make, and this is a very, very important one to me, and I'll come back to it at the end of what I'm going to say, is it is laughable that the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, and the PLO, after 70 years, actually 50 years, have not invested in the infrastructure to be able to make our case. Not from a media perspective, not from a political, I'm speaking about the states mainly, not from a political perspective, not from a diplomatic perspective, not from a civil society perspective. A couple examples. From a civil society perspective, I've been out of the States for 25 years. What happened during the last 25 years is earth-shattering. It is unbelievable where the US was from a civil society perspective and where they are today. When I was 25 years ago active in the States, there was one voice for the Jewish pro-Israeli community. It was AIPAC. Today, there's a menu of organizations with all different flavors, from Jewish Voice for Peace to J Street to many others, who are able to engage in this issue with different flavors of how they approach it. It is no longer a monotone when you speak about this within the Jewish community. That's important. Another example would be solidarity, the solidarity movement. BDS movement has done wonders to bring the issue to the forefront. BDS, I believe, has one major flaw, like most of our solidarity movement activities. It's an effort which refuses to identify with an end game. If you hold Israel accountable for their violations without defining an end game, then you become a policeman. You're trying to hold somebody accountable, and you let the judge decide if they're guilty or not. We are not a policeman to Israel or anyone else for that matter. We are in a political conflict. Any element of resistance, nonviolent I would hope, in our community has to articulate a political endgame if we're serious about wanting to find a resolution to the conflict. Okay, so that's the ecosystem that we're working in, a very, very difficult one. Now, to move to Trump. To me, Trump is a clown. You said it better. He's empty-headed. That's very diplomatic. He's a clown. I don't think Trump is the issue, nor do I think his deal-making ethos is what we need to be worried about. I believe the biggest threat to Trump today is the Republican Party, because he was the vehicle that brought the Republican Party back to power. Amazing how he did it. Racism, sexism, xenophobia, Muslimphobia, Islamophobia, all the things you want to, all the phobias out there he used to bring the Republicans to power. Today, post being elected, the greatest threat to the Republican Party is Trump himself. So one of two things I think will happen. He will either learn very quickly that when you're the president of the United States, you're only the president of the United States. The system in the US, and I say this hoping that it's still true, is much stronger than the individuals that come through it. We saw that with the first Bush administration, Bush Jr. He wasn't even able to make a full sentence for 2 years, but he was still president. If he learns the game, he may stay where he's at and send Twitters every day, and the whole media world will talk about his Twitters. But the state, the establishment, the deep state, is much more than Trump's art-making book. The deep state is very clear where it stands on our issue. And I'm going to go through very, very quickly the historic record, just so we can keep it in mind. Truman, as Kerry reminded us in his December speech, 7 minutes after Israel was declared, recognized it. Kennedy talked about Israel as a special relationship, but not exclusive. He understood that the region, Saudi Arabia mainly, also needs to be an ally. Johnson spoke about shared values. Nixon spoke about we won't fight their wars, but we'll support them and arm them. Then 1973 war came, and basically they started to have this shuttle where they served arms galore shuttle, I forgot what they call it, air shuttle to serve Israel's arms needs during that war. Then came Carter, and he said that there's a special relationship, but within a regional context, and he talked about Palestinian homeland, that there needs to be a solution for this sore spot within the region. Moving on, Reagan came, talked about a strategic partnership with Israel, and introduced loan guarantees to support Israel. Then came Bush Sr., introduced the issue in a very clear way about a Jewish state, and then also used the loan guarantees to force Shamir to come to the Madrid conference. Then came Clinton. We all know what happened there. Camp David failure, the Clinton parameters. Bush Jr. issued guarantees to Sharon, guarantees that Netanyahu is using today to say that he interprets those to mean that settlements can continue to be built. And then 9/11 came, and terrorism and the whole issue of security overwhelmed the administration and the global community, and that served Israel very well. Then came Obama. Obama, who's getting the biggest amount of heat from the Israeli side. Almost, they want to, label him anti-Semitic. I think they may have in some of the statements. The facts don't line up. Obama has been, and I'm sure we're all reading the same materials that are out there, the most loyal, the most strategic, both in arms, both in security cooperation, and of course in money, with the $38 billion agreement that just came through. However, he did something which Israel couldn't swallow. Allowing Resolution 2334 to pass doesn't match those very supportive elements of his presidency. Why? I don't think it's because Obama one day woke up and said, those poor Palestinians, we really should support them. They have rights and they've been on the wrong side of the equation. That's not the US. I believe that the US started to act publicly, and the only time you can act publicly on this issue in the US is after elections of your second term. Those 20 or 30 days is the window to act. Otherwise, you pay a huge political price, given this issue is not a foreign issue in the US, it's a domestic issue. So he acted. He acted in the service of Israel. He acted to save Israel from itself. Why? Because I believe the institution of the United States, not necessarily the president only, sees very well that Israel is driving drunk on power and is about to fall off the cliff. And the cliff has a name to it. It's called two states. And I believe they also understand that we Palestinians can live in any political arrangement that the politicians agree to. Actually, we would prefer one state if it was a choice on a menu. If you stop Palestinians and open their shirts, you'll find many have a map of Palestine. It's not the West Bank and Gaza strung together with a rubber band. It's the historic British mandated state of Palestine. That's where our heart is. But our minds have politically matured to fall in line with international law and accept two states. They see the two-state option. The US sees the two-state option about to be lost, and thus that's why I think they acted. But even when they acted, they couldn't act more than what they did without the Democratic Party paying a price. So they acted as an administration, but when the 70 countries came together in the UK in Paris the other day, they couldn't follow through with that to translate what they know and now have articulated into policy. What would that have looked like? And I wrote about this a day before the conference. What would that have looked like if they were serious about the rhetoric of two states? It would have looked like recognition of Palestine. It would have brought 138 countries plus all the rest forward to confirm the recognition of the other part of the two-state equation. And what that would have done, and still I think that should be done, it would normalize how third states view the two parties. Clearly, the international community is not able to solve it. Clearly, we, alone with the Israelis, are not able to solve it. So I believe there's a responsibility for third states 50 years later to actually normalize how they view the two states politically, both with 3 borders defined and 1 shared border undefined. It's exactly how Israel is defined today, and they were able to get recognition 7 minutes after announcing the state back in 1948. Isn't it time 50 years later that we do the same as third states to the Palestinian side? And then call for negotiations for all the issues that do have to be negotiated. To close, so what's changing, in my opinion, with Trump coming in is not the policy. The policy of the US has been clearly, blindly in support of the state of Israel, diplomatically, politically, on the international arena, even with the settlements. If we go and if we chart the wording about settlements, it keeps going down and down and down. At one point it was illegal, then it became illegitimate, then it became a barrier to peace, then it becomes complicated. It becomes, the wording has been watered down. That's the US. And I don't believe the US is about to do an about face and get on the right side of history. So Trump can tweet as much as he wants, but at the end of the day, this conflict is a deep one within the institution called the United States, and their decision has been made a long time ago. So I end with a very important question to my own community and to my own leadership. What is it that we want from the US? Is all of our work in addressing the US and addressing Trump and going back and forth to the White House? During the Clinton years, it was the most visited entity that went to the White House were the Palestinians. What do we want from them? I don't believe we want an about face. I think we want to push back against what the support that that Israel is getting from the US, to push back, to give an opening for third states to act. This is a third state responsibility, especially while we're under occupation. And the only way to get third states to act is to expose what Israel is doing more and more within the US community, so they have a harder time to be blindly supporting Israel. That's all we can ask for. And that goes back to the point I made earlier. To do that, we have to invest in media, in politics, in having a proper diplomatic representation in the US, et cetera, et cetera. I believe the Oslo process came. Clinton opened the doors of the White House and the State Department, and the leadership in Ramallah got all excited. They said, we have access. Now, every time we have a problem, we just fly to the State Department and we talk to them. They were thinking as if the US was another Arab country, that once you get to the president, that's it, you have solved the issue. And the US is a different kind of animal. In the US, policy is made in 50 states. It culminates in Washington, D.C. If you're serious about the US, you have to invest in the 50 states. And I say that without any illusion that we can create a AIPAC-like organization. We can't. We don't have the organization, we don't have the money, we don't have the insight. But we don't need an AIPAC-like organization, because the communities in the US, as we've seen during the last 25 years, are growing in support of Palestinians and Palestinian statehood. How do we translate that into policy? It requires real work. It's not going to happen by itself. Thank you.
With a divided society, with the weak representatives, with so many battles, can we find a consensus on any strategy in Palestine today? Is it a possibility to talk about the non-violence resistance movement, resist to exist in a new tone, a new language between the youth who are not representing the Fatah or Hamas or any faction or the Sofa faction? It's a big question. How can you develop a strategy in the absence of leadership, in the absence of any consensus, in a divided society, and daily battles that you cannot breathe coming from the Israelis? And the other issue is how to reach the Israelis before reaching Trump. The Israelis are closing the door, closing the eyes, closing the mind, and they are not interested in anything but possession, ownership, and destruction of what is left of Palestine. We witness the Minister of Education. If I want to compare between the two scenarios in the 90s and today, Yussi Sarid, when he was the Minister of Education, with the idea of educating the youth and reaching out for the two-state solution, the message of the Intifada at the time, he said we should teach our children, the poems of Mahmoud Darwish. They should know about Mahmoud Darwish. They should know about the Palestinian trauma, the Palestinian Nakba. But today, the Minister of Education in Israel is saying Palestinians are not there. We have to annex West Bank. We have to put them in these cantons, these prisons. It's our golden time to take it over. So it's a different word and different representative and different agenda. I would like very much to open the floor for the questions period. I would like to hear your comments, especially from the diplomatic representative in this room. Can you raise your voice? Can you challenge this argument? Can you tell me what you can provoke these people with any ideas? Who said me? Who said me? I'm asking for the diplomat first. I know this is off record. Nobody's going to quote you. But your reflection about Trump, Palestinians in the prison culture, I love to have you always here, but I want to see some reflections. I lost the case. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much.
You were saying Lithuania?
Lithuania, exactly.
Great power?
The superpower. Thank you very much. I'm coming from Lithuania, one of those countries that haven't been mentioned among the 138, nor among the 9 during the vote. Yet I would like just to agree strongly and to continue the point made by Mr. Bahur on the issue of reaching out to the public and reaching out to the societies. The idea was of reaching out to 50 states in the US. There is another player in the room. It's the European Union. Brussels, well, it's perfect, it works, it's efficient, regardless of what everyone says. But there are 28 member states, and they are sitting. I put this question yesterday to one of the directors of the departments at the PLO about adequate representation of Palestine in the EU member states. And when the European Council takes solution, it takes usually by consensus, particularly in the foreign and defense policy. So the outreach to the civil societies, the informational outreach to the societies, and well, relevant representation. And so this is another question to be raised. Well, I had another point just to reflect upon the intifadas. Yesterday, during one of the meetings with the Palestinian politicians, one junior Fatah member mentioned that, well, second wasn't a real intifada. The second wasn't a real intifada.
Oh. You were quoting some Syrian officials.
And here, well, I've been speaking with the lower ranks. This coincides with the ideas that were mentioned of the second intifada by Professor Siegel, that second intifada ruined Israeli left. And if I'm wrong in the interpretation, if I didn't hear it well, so please correct me. My question is about the second intifada as such. To which extent it was productive, if at all? This is another this was a provocation you asked. Thank you.
Can you pass it to some? Yes, the French Consul General, please. Welcoming him to Palestine, his vision, coming from Paris conference with a new agenda. Let's see the two-state solution, 3D settlement. 70 countries telling the world, don't move the embassy to Jerusalem.
Well, not exactly, but it was
Help me
implicit.
to understand it. Help me.
Could you identify yourself?
Yes, just
It works, it's working.
It's okay?
Yes.
No, I've mainly a question to Sam Bahour. We started this discussion on another occasion on recognition.
Could you identify yourself? Just tell us a word as to who you are.
Yes, I'm Pierre Cochat, the French Consul General in Jerusalem.
Okay, thank you.
Back to the mention made by Sam Bahour on recognition. So as it was mentioned, we have today, I think, more than 138 countries that have decided already to recognize Palestine as a state. What, besides symbolism, and I don't underestimate the impact of symbolism and in the diplomatic arena, what besides symbolism would have as an effect recognition by the countries, mainly in EU, that have not yet recognized Palestine? On a concrete, let's say, on the concrete aspect of the negotiation of the peace prospect, do you see it as changing completely the game in your relation with Israel? Do you think that it may really help peace to become a more realistic perspective? I personally, of course, clearly understand the symbol, and it may have an impact, of course, especially at a time when other actors like the US are on a completely other track. But I think I would like to know more about the impact you see of such a gesture on the side of EU countries.
Thank
Both
you.
of you. I have 2 questions and 2 comments.
Very briefly, the second intifada, as far as I'm concerned, was totally unproductive. I was here during the first intifada. There's a lot that can be said about the first intifada, but we've only had 2. And they were very different acts, so I'm not sure, we need a third one to know exactly what's the definition of intifada. Anything, in my opinion, which is going to take up arms as if we have leverage militarily against Israel is a losing battle, in my opinion. It's not because I'm a peacenik. It's because it's a hard, cold calculation. I understand Israel as having one game book. It's the game book of violence. When we go to a different game, they have no idea whatsoever how to start to address us. When you're taking on a boxing champion, you don't go and say, do you want to have a boxing match with me? You go to that person and say, would you like to play ping pong? You might win. And I think we need to play more ping pong and stop the notion, and this is part of maybe the broader educational leadership that needs to be done on the Palestinian leadership side, is lead the nonviolent resistance, don't just call for it. Otherwise, you're opening the door for people to articulate violent and nonviolent means of resistance. Regarding recognition, thank you for the question. I've been spending a lot of time writing and talking and thinking about this. Put the symbolism aside. We have so much symbolism, we can put it in bottles and export it. I want to talk about non-symbolic issues. The Israeli side, especially over the last 20 years of Oslo, have had the luxury of time of breaking up the society into issues that are then put on the negotiating table. Everything from Jerusalem, the right of return, and 3G frequencies for our telephones so we can have data. Everything in our community has been put on a table of negotiations. My question is why? Why are we allowing the negotiating table, which is already loaded with heavy issues, to be overly loaded with issues that are either humanitarian or don't require negotiations? Here comes the issue of recognition. If recognition is done, I believe it opens up several things. First, as was done in 2012 at a General Assembly level, it allows the Palestinians to start having tools where it alone can start to hold Israel accountable. So if you as third states don't have the political ability, the political will, the inertia, the interest to hold Israel accountable for whatever reasons, at least allow the Palestinians the tools to act in their own agency to hold Israel accountable non-violently. Recognition did that, and we're seeing the use of those tools, as I noted. Secondly, when a state recognizes Palestine, and if the international community collectively would recognize Palestine, then we should be able to say all the parties involved, even though we may not believe them all, but politically they're all on the record of stating that the solution to this conflict is a two-state solution. The Palestinians are dying for it. They brought it to the UN. The US is singing about it. And even Israel and Bar Ilan, when he made the speech and put 142 adjectives in front of the words two states, registered that he wants two states, even though the Likud as a party doesn't. But let's take him for face value and say that the parties involved are all aligned with two states. Well, there happens to be more than just Palestine and Israel as two states in this world, and the EU knows this best. There's Canada and Mexico, there's Canada and the US, there's all the European countries which are bordering states. When they have frequency interference, do they launch a war against each other in Belgium? No. They go to the International Telecommunications Union and they solve the issue as per the parameters of that venue. When there's a postal issue, they go to the International Postal Union and they solve the issue as per the parameters of that organization. So if everyone is for two states and recognition happens, then the international community can start dealing with the two parties as per another set of references, and they happen to be many, which are all the different international venues that are out there. An additional point, which I think is of utmost importance, especially for the US, is that once you recognize as a single state, once you recognize the Palestinian side, number one, you're forcing the Palestinian to act like a state. And you should hold us accountable to that as well. But more importantly, in the US, for example, and I would say now after seeing what happened in Paris and 70s countries, the same would apply. Today, the political will to hold Israel seriously accountable does not exist, for whatever reasons. So one way to hold Israel accountable indirectly is not only to recognize the state of Palestine, but create that as a platform. So when Israel doesn't move forward as it should, like in stopping settlement building, the support of those states to Palestine can be an indirect way to show Israel that we are serious about a future Palestinian state and we're going to invest in it. When I go to some of the US officials and I say, you have US aid is putting millions and millions of dollars here in healthcare and training, for what purpose? It's either just to keep us quiet and have food on the table, which could be a strategy, or it's seriously wanting to build the infrastructure so a state can in the future emerge. So all of this support needs to be put within the framework of creating the state on the ground, piece by piece, as a way to kind of like hold Israel accountable. If the international community was able to hold Israel accountable directly, that's a straight line. I don't think we're going to see a straight line, especially not with Trump.
Let's see. I agree with a fair bit of what Sam has said, but I want to sort of identify the areas of agreement and possible disagreement, which may be serious and maybe not, because I'm not quite sure. But this would be a way of maybe pressing Sam, and then I'd like to respond a bit to Monty's critique of my remarks. I think Sam is very right about the importance of the American audience and the fluidity in the United States, and that things are changing from where they are. At the same time, there are two things that trouble me. First, is I think that there was that Sam's statement about what Palestinian strategy is, meaning PLO strategy. I actually think that was inaccurate. I don't think the Palestinian strategy is the end of bilateral negotiations and the moving on to these various moves in the international arena and these other things that could be added to that. I think that the PLO is still very much committed to negotiation strategy. What it has reached the conclusion is that negotiations with this particular government are pointless. And the only basis on which it would do that would be in exchange for that, not because it thinks that those negotiations would go anywhere, but if you can get in exchange for giving the Israelis, this government, a peace process, in exchange for that get a halt to settlements, then that's a trade-off, even if it's a meaningless peace process, because it would freeze the change of facts on the ground. So that's its approach to this government. But the Palestinian strategy is deeply committed, in my view, to negotiations, but in a relatively passive way. And one of the things I would point to is, look, just at the very time that Abu Mazen was not giving an answer to the American parameters that Kerry and Obama presented to him, he was engaged in secret negotiations with Herzog to work out an alternative framework. And they did work out an alternative framework that was secret, that wasn't known to the Americans at the time, but among other things was one of the explanations of why they would say no to the Americans, because why in the world, even if it was satisfactory, which it wasn't, but why in the world would they accept a less adequate framework from the Netanyahu government when they had a more adequate framework worked out with the guy who was going to run against Netanyahu in the next election? And I actually had a conversation with Abu Mazen before the elections, and I asked him about what the significance of the Israeli elections were. And he said to me, he said, if Netanyahu wins, there's no possibility of an agreement. And if Herzog wins, maybe. And then he said it again, maybe. But what it meant was, if Herzog wins, we're going to go into negotiations with him and find out. Just as he said, you know, if Olmert hadn't gone to jail, and we had another 6 months, and similarly with respect to Taba, if Sharon hadn't won, there were real possibilities that we could negotiate an end to the solution. Now, what that means is something very fundamental, what it means is there's no such thing as the Israelis. And whenever somebody starts talking about strategy and starts using a term like the Israelis, that's the cue card to that they're missing something. There's an enormous difference, and I think Abu Mazen is right about this, as to the possibilities of reaching a peace agreement and ending the occupation, depending on who governs in Israel. And the decision about who governs in Israel is made by the Israeli people. And that's one of the things that troubles me about Sam's presentation, though it may just have been that a question of focus, which is that while he's right in talking about the American audience, he didn't talk about what I was talking about, which is the Israeli audience. And what I was saying is that ultimately, this is a conflict between the two peoples. And the bottom line issue, if it's an issue between us, I don't know, but it's a very important thing for Palestinians to understand about power, okay? There is no power on the planet that has both the will and the ability to force Israel out of the West Bank, to force it to share refugees, to share Jerusalem, to force it to do anything on refugees if it feels it's against its interest to do so. And there won't be, in the foreseeable future that I can see, any power on this planet that will have the combination of the will and the power to do that. And for the longest time, Palestinians have lived under the illusion, and that was in the Al-Quds piece that I read you a little bit from, that I wrote 24 years ago. I was saying the same thing, which is that the international community will turn out to disappoint you. This international conference, the PLO talked about it, the Husseini document unfortunately talked about it, but before even the Declaration of Independence idea emerged, when you asked the Palestinians in the Intifada, how is this going to happen? Either they said, well, strategy is up to the PLO, or they said there'll be an international conference, we'll engage the national interests of the great powers, and they will force an end to the occupation. And their version of the international conference was Versailles. Well, you didn't get Versailles, okay? You got Madrid, and we just had Paris, okay? So that's what the international community is prepared to do. And if you think that that's a strategy, rather than acts of desperation, which basically are playing really to the loss of credibility that a negotiation strategy has meant for Abu Mazen, I think you're missing the dynamic. I look at all this international stuff, and I think it's a joke. And I think Netanyahu plays along with the joke by making it sound so important. But the truth of the matter is that these UN resolutions don't mean anything. He makes a big deal about it, and he whips up the American Jewish community about it. And if you want to know where things are in the United States, think about H.R. 11, which you probably haven't paid too much attention to. But H.R. 11 was a resolution of the House of Representatives that passed a couple of weeks ago that condemned the Obama administration for abstaining on the Security Council resolution. And it passed 342 votes to 80 votes. And in that 342, there were a majority of the Democrats. So the majority of the Democrats spanked Obama, the outgoing president, who actually is one of the most popular presidents in American history, in exiting. And part of what this tells you is, no, I mean, Sam is very right that you have to play ping pong, but very wrong in saying that the only game that Israel knows how to play is the game of force. Israel is very good at ping pong too, very good. And if you don't understand what's happened in the United States and the American Jewish community and AIPAC's role and Netanyahu's going to the Congress, read the congressional record and the debate over H.R. 11, and you'll see congressman after congressman repeating the talking points, which are intellectual garbage. They're intellectual garbage, but they fill the congressional record, and part of what they play on, though, are the weak points. So, for instance, what they talk about, among other things, all the things to discredit the Palestinians. So they talk about incitement, and they're not talking about what's on television. They're talking about payments to the families of people who carried out knifing attacks. And what they're saying is that, if not just the PLO policy, but they're saying if you have a society which performs these kind of attacks and then supports calling these martyrs, you don't have a people that's ready for peace. And so what they've sold is a narrative, and they've sold it very effectively, very effectively. Now, part of the things that I'm talking about being creative and new peace processes and the common homeland and so on, part of that is the question of how do you speak to these different audiences? Not just the American audience, but the Israeli audience. And part of my disagreement with you, Marty, isn't that I believe that you can win over the Israeli people, because that's talking about the Israeli people. The difference is that I see the Israeli elections as close. I see Zippy Livni as somebody who, in fact, if she had been prepared, to make a compromise on funding the religious institutions, in fact, was given the first choice to form a government. And because she was unable to do it, because she couldn't bring in the religious parties, because of some strange commitment, given the stakes, to principle, we ended up with Netanyahu as prime minister. But what I'm saying is that Israeli elections are close, and you don't have to win 50% or 70% or change the minds of 70% of the Israelis. What you've got to do is move the margin that determines who will form the government. And then you get to the point of Abu Mazen's maybe. And I believe that if you reinforce that with the kind of thing that I was talking about, which is, let's say, bringing Iran into the API and actually making a major national security interest of Israel depend on resolving things with the Palestinians, then you've got a winning strategy. The stuff that's going on now are elements, but I think actually they don't express a strategy. And if you want to, if they do express a strategy, it's a bad strategy. Because try to explain to me, or explain to yourself, how does A lead to B lead to C? How does what the PLO is doing now actually lead to Israel making a decision to withdraw from the territories? What's the fundamental causal movement? Where does it come from? Is it that the United States is going to threaten to cut off aid? You think that that's going to happen at this late date? Does anyone still believe that? I mean, everything that's happened in the international community is wrong. We could have believed before, at one point, we could have believed, well, maybe if the Muslim Brotherhood takes over Egypt, that we'll have this fundamental change in the foreign policy of the most powerful Arab country, and it'll reverse the national interest security equation that existed before Sadat came to Jerusalem. But we saw what happened. The Muslim Brotherhood was respectful of the Israeli-Egyptian treaty just as well, and now they're gone. So it's just simply not going to happen. The only way that you're going to get an end to the occupation is ultimately to have an Israeli government in power that sees it in its interest to do so. And that involves credibility of peace, and it involves these other national interests.
Thank you very much. If you have election tomorrow in Israel, you have the settlers convening a government. You'll have Bennett forming a government. We are going to that direction as we come to see how the Israeli society is developing. It's not this group or that group. There is no peace group. There is no Labour Party. There is no merits. It's a different world. The settlers are taking over in Israel today. Can I have, yes please. The mic here, you have it. You have the mic.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Andrian Asse.
Short question because the time is running.
I am the
Thank you.
representative of
Raise your
Austria to
voice.
the Palestinian Authority. Thank you for the invitation. I have a question to both gentlemen. The pivotal position of the United States in the Middle East peace process used to be based on the fact that they had closer relations to Israel and the PLO than those two between each other. Now this position has been lost due to the fact that Trump has thrown his weight fully with the one side, at least if you believe his announcements. Another event which took place on the 15th of January was a meeting in Russia between the Palestinian faction. This appears to me to be an indication that Russia is very close to the Palestinian side now. We might even have a symmetric situation where you have the US completely on the side of Israel without any basis for discussion with the Palestinians, and Russia on the side of the Palestinians with a better basis for discussion with Israel than the US has with the Palestinians. In light of what's happening between in terms of chemistry, an opportunity for direct negotiations, co-sponsored even by Russia and the US. Geneva, substantial manner. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Actually, there's a very important venue in Austria, which is the Bruno Kreisky Forum, which has been studying for the last several years. I'm part of the group doing it, alternatives to partition. What are the different flavors of two states to try to be more creative? I don't believe that is a huge opportunity, and I'll tell you why. First, don't buy into this friendship between Trump and Putin. I think that the interests at play are very, very different. And I think that's going to show out very closely, especially if Trump is out to Iran more accountable, taking into consideration that Russia and Iran are strategically allied. This will complicate things in the first 24 hours of his office. More importantly, in terms of is it an opportunity for us? I come from the school of thought which says we should no longer be discussing a potential venue, international or otherwise, to discuss the state. For me, the state exists. As per international fora, the state exists. Unfortunately, the U.S. did not say yes to it, but it exists. And we have, like other countries, have taken non-member observer status steps towards full membership. The question at play is how do we make the state exist on the ground? And in the meantime, how do we bring into the equation, which Kerry did, the Fourth Geneva Convention to maintain that this is a military occupation, which comes with rules. I don't see a venue happening in the short term to make a deal. And mainly it goes back to one of the things Jeremy said, which I would disagree with a little bit with him. When I hear your word, it's as if you missed the last 15 years in Israel. That Israel, yes, has gone so far right, it's no longer an issue of a party issue where just another party would win, things would be better. I think the shift is systematic and deep within the society. I believe Israel today, when it looks in the mirror, it doesn't see the reflection of the state of Israel. It sees the reflection of an ideology called Zionism. And it's in a very, very difficult moment. What do they choose? The reality of a state being accepted in the international community like other states, which has rules and regulations applied to them, Or do they continue to try to implement the ideology which ultimately will bring them to an imposed one-state reality that they cannot live in today? I wish that was different. I'll end by I have a whole story I give, but I just want to give the last part of it. My daughter is MIT graduate, smart girl, globalized girl. Before she went off to school, I brought her home and we had a discussion with some of her peers because I wanted to write an article about what the younger generation is thinking. The punchline of what she told me was the following. She ended about a 10-minute discussion, or more than that, by saying that we're not going to make the same mistakes your generation made. Maybe it's time we deal with Israel differently. Maybe we should look Israel in the eye and say, Israel, congratulations, you win. We are in a strategic, historical conflict, you win. You get Israel, you get the West Bank, you get West Jerusalem, you get East Jerusalem, you get all the frequencies, you get all the water, we'll throw in Gaza for free. And you know what else you get? Us. Now, we heard you have free healthcare in Israel. Where do we pick up our medical cards? The younger generation in Palestine is standing at a crossroads. Either they continue to pound their head against the wall like we have in order to maintain statehood and make the state reality. It's not an ideal state. It's not an ideal solution. It's a workable solution aligned with international law. Or they come to the conclusion that maybe as a people we are too weak to create a state, and they drop that and turn this conflict into a civil rights movement. Israeli defense ministers and Israeli prime ministers in office publicly stated, if the Palestinians make that move, the game is over. It may take 100 years of a civil rights movement, but then we go into a full-time apartheid situation, the game is over. And that's why I appealed to third states to act now, and that's why I was waiting for Paris to produce more than it did. If you cannot come to recognize the other state on paper, then what are we talking about recognizing it in reality? And that's the value of two states, is to allow an entire Palestinian generation to have a little bit more hope that the international community is real, understanding that they're not going to solve it. What will solve it is what the EU started to do, like the Horizon 2020 guidelines, like the labeling of products. They don't know how to play ping pong. They fired ministers who were in the EU because they didn't see this coming. They can be taken off balance with the BDS movement. They can be taken off balance with the work of the Jewish community in the States trying to hold them accountable. I don't think they have a game other than violence, personally.
Two things. First of all, in terms of my own thought, I would ask you to remember where I started from, which is that there are three strategic approaches, and that I said that I would emphasize one of them, which is the belief that it matters who's in power in Israel and that there's still a future for negotiations. But there are two other perspectives that have merit, and they also have strategies attached to it that need to be developed. And I think on all three of them, I think there's a very serious absence of subtle Palestinian strategic thought. I didn't get into the other two, and I won't now because it'll take us too far apart. But remember, one of them, the second one, was basically explicitly saying negotiations have been a farce. Let's go back to where we were in the first Intifada, which is the creativity of unilaterally bringing the state into existence on the ground. That was the whole thing about the Intifada, is that it wasn't just a revolt, it was basically withdrawing the power of governance from the Israeli authorities and transferring it to institutions that it was creating in the Intifada. Ultimately, the PLO abandoned it. The PLO actually moved against the spirit of the Intifada after the declaration by its failure to establish a real government here. Today, the possibility actually exists that there is a government here called the PA. The joke is that all that stands in the way of meeting all of the international conditions for that being a state is that the PA agreed with Israel that it wouldn't be a state. But in fact, if the PLO decides, as it were, to rename the PA, the government of the state of Palestine, and simply refuses to, and says Oslo is over, and I would go a step further, get rid of the PLO. just have everything be the state of Palestine, then that's it. You do meet the conditions, and you actually will control some things on the ground, and then your nonviolent struggle can be directed against asserting genuine sovereign control. And it will start city by city, it will start in Nablus and so on. But to do that successfully, it's not just a question of nonviolence. Nonviolence is a tactic, it's not a strategy. And for it to be a strategy, you've got to have it in a larger context that will explain under what conditions will that tactic work. And what I'm saying is that there has to be creative, powerful, diplomatic peace initiative that the PLO says yes to, that explains, it was a bigger version of what you said about the BDS not talking about the end game. If you go to nonviolent tactics designed to bring the state into reality on the ground, more than ever, there has to be a clear end game that is a genuine promise of peace. And the way to do that is something that you're going to sign on. It could be Geneva. If the PLO wanted to do something, it could say, here's a peace agreement. It was agreed to, by such and such people inside of Israel and non-official and so on, but we're prepared to sign it. Or as I said, we're prepared to go to negotiations and make a decision about it after 9 months. Now, Mahdi was saying that when I talked about the, basing it on the Arab Peace Initiative and having the Egypt or Saudi Arabia ask Trump to fill it in, he was saying that that's not possible. He may be right. I'd like to test that out. But the point is that that's a mechanism to have the Arab states do it. I've put forward 3 different mechanisms for that. My basic proposal was UNSCOP 2, which is you go to the General Assembly, which created UNSCOP 1, not the Security Council, and you create UNSCOP 2. Yeah, but no, but the thing is that it comes up with a petition resolution that's appropriate for today, and unlike 48, the Palestinian side says yes, and the Netanyahu government says no. That changes the environment within which you can succeed with a nonviolent movement.
That's what we are today, 138.
No, but you don't have a detailed peace agreement that the Palestinians have said we're prepared to sign. You don't have a new petition resolution that's either been developed on the basis of the API or has been developed by an international commission sanctioned by the United Nations. So the question is, how do you get the PLO to say yes to something that's definitive? And the narrative of the history of the negotiations that the Israelis, who are very good at ping pong, have sold to the Americans, and have also that Netanyahu has sold to the Israeli people, is in fact that the history of the negotiations is that the PLO has 3 times said no to at least reasonable offers, right? Taba, let's forget about Camp David. But they said no to Taba, they said no to Olmert, and now they said no to Kerry. Now, we can talk forever about whether those are adequate or not, and so on. But the one thing that is true, and that insiders in the American government will tell you, who are very friendly to the Palestinian cause, is that the Palestinian tactics inside the negotiations drove them crazy because they never responded at Camp David or elsewhere with a Palestinian counteroffer that gave them something to work with. Clinton was prepared to do a lot more than be a busboy for the Israeli policy. Well, what I'm saying is that there's got to be a change. Yes, but the question is, how do you bring it about? How do you play ping pong? And the truth of the matter is, you're right, you've got to play ping pong, but guess what? My judgment, you guys don't know how to play ping pong. The only time you played ping pong successfully was in the Intifada, and in 1 month, essentially, between November of 1988 and December, and you moved. What you did at that point was that you opened the door for the PLO to stop being a terrorist organization 1,400 miles away, and successfully did something that seemed impossible, which was 5 years later, be the guest of an American president on the White House lawn. That was, it may have been a mistaken strategy, but it was a triumph of Palestinian diplomacy that did something that seemed impossible. You were a leper in 1987 internationally, and you had Bill Clinton's arms around you 5 years later. That was ping pong. Well, you haven't done it since.
You want us to Do a hands up.
Sorry.
No.
Sorry,
No,
please.
I'm saying use your head.
Please.
Sorry.
We have been loyal to the PLO. We will continue to be loyal to the PLO, our embodiment of national aspiration, and we hope the PLO now will move to other stage. Thank you very much.
Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is an Islamic site since 1,400 years in UNESCO. The third meeting, Paris, 70 countries, two-state solution, freezing settlement, go back to negotiation. My answer was, we are not married to the Israelis. We will never. And especially with Washington telling the Brits, go and veto anything as United Nations. If those who don't remember Putin coming to Israel and gave 2 million Russians to Israel and embracing, but what is for us in Moscow? All the faction there is telling us, sharing the cake, we want to be ministers and say, next, occupy, control, whatever. We are the power. And now we have Trump. We published for him as Pastor his book on Palestinian state. Does he have something new to tell us? Are we expecting? We are not melted and we are not disappearing. We are still steadfast with the message I received on resist to exist. Is it part of our agenda? Today we are here too. Like some Israelis are telling me 5 million Palestinian, 5 million Israelis today. Forget the narrative, we agree. My understanding, the West created Israel. Move the
Palestinian state. And then the third perspective state solution, and it's not for the future, it's already here. We have one unequal. And what's needed is to face up to the fact that it is one country, and then to launch from an article that was published in Al-Quds in April of 19. They'd be interested in publishing something in the paper, and they said there is no representation at such negotiations. Not much is heard about what happens if such negotiations begin. A bit deeper, we see that the present strategy for attaining an independent Palestinian state itself came into existence. Following the United Nations Petition Resolution of 1947, the U.S. State Department, they did not get Arab or Palestinian advance approval. They did not negotiate with the Palestinians. It's about a different deal. There's 150 balls up in the air, and it's global. It's New York City, it's Atlantic City. This happened out of Trump. And I think the Palestinians can do the same thing. That with the half-century anniversary of the occupation demonstrated actually is that while a Palestinian state in the West Bank won't be an existential threat, nonetheless it can make life in